Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first of a very special four-part series. It's a pleasure to welcome participants from across the globe, from the United States, Latin America, Europe, Israel, and beyond. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Israel, the Iranian people seeking freedom, and everyone affected by the conflict in the region that's taking place today. My name is Michael Steinberger, founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit platform dedicated to research, to preserve, and most importantly, to promote the legacy of Sfarad. For those joining us for the first time, allow me to explain the word Sepharad in Hebrew literally means Spain, but historically speaking, it refers to the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. To broaden our scope and expand our reach, we formed strategic alliances with organizations, institutions, governments, and individuals across the public and private sectors that together create a voice of the collective, thereby amplifying our message. We are grateful to our hosting partners or co-hosting partners and community supporters who help promote these programs. So please allow me to begin by acknowledging and thanking today's co-hosting partners for helping promote today's event. A hearty welcome to MAST, the Massachusetts Anti-Semitism Synagogue Task Force, our newest co-hosting partner, for their amazing support in promoting today's event. MAST is a coalition designed to bring together synagogues and other groups to combat anti-Semitism, educate the public, and advocate for Jewish communities across Massachusetts and beyond. A special shout out and thank you to Jewish Virtual Library, a comprehensive online encyclopedia focused on Jewish history, culture, and current events. Thank you for your support in promoting today's event. I would also like to thank and acknowledge our other partners for helping promote today's event, and they are the Women's International Zionist Organization, known as WITSO of Florida, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, also in Miami, referred to as CAGE, the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, Anna Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, the Matthias Project, RICHI, the Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, the Institute for Critical Study of Anti-Semitism, Jewish Unity Through Diversity, the European Jewish Community Center headquartered in Brussels, Belgium, Kulanu of Canada, and last but certainly not least, Havat Torah Congregation. Thank you, one and all. A brief note about today's presentation. Today's presentation is the first session of our four-part series, The Western Sephardic Atlantic, Renewal, Influence, and Legacy. The series explores the remarkable journey of the Western Sephardim, descendants of Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal, many of whom lived for generations as conversos before returning back to normative Judaism. From Amsterdam to the Caribbean and to the Americas, they rebuilt vibrant Jewish communities and forged transatlantic networks that helped shape the Atlantic world and the world we live in today. Their story is one of migration, resilience, and renewal across continents and centuries. We are honored to have Professor Wim Klooster deliver these webinar programs. Professor Klooster is a scholar of early modern Atlantic world whose research explores the Dutch Empire, global trade networks, and diasporic communities. His work has deepened our understanding of how Western Sephardic Jewish communities helped shape the Atlantic societies and the economic culture development of the early modern era. So with that, thank you all again for joining us today. And now it is my extreme pleasure to welcome Professor Kim Klooster for part one, the Sephardic Atlantic from Amsterdam to the Americas. Professor Klooster, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and welcome to everybody, wherever you are in the world watching us. It's my pleasure to start the four-part series today, and let me start by sharing my PowerPoint presentation. So I'll begin with this overview of what you can expect today. The terms that you see on the screen, I will explain. The developments I will explain, and I will begin in the year 1492. 1492 was not just the year in which Christopher Columbus was perhaps the first European to discover the Americas. 1492 was also a pivotal year in the history of Spain because it saw, in the early days of January, the completion of the reconquest by Christians of the Muslim strongholds in Spain. And it was also the year in which the Jewish population was expelled from Spain. That is to say, they were forced to choose between staying and leaving. If they stayed, they could only stay as Christians. Many Jews left then for neighboring Portugal, where they were forcibly converted just 4 years later. So by the turn of the century, around 1500, the Iberian Peninsula was officially without Jews. The inhabitants were all Christians, or, as former Jews were labeled, new Christians, people viewed with suspicion by the Spanish Inquisition, which had only recently been established in order to fight heresy. In the wake of the voyages of Columbus and in the wake of the Spanish conquest across the Americas, people of Jewish descent started settling in Spain's new American colonies, usually for economic reasons, although some may have been drawn to a world far away, at least initially far away, from inquisitorial persecution. These Jewish settlers ignored the instructions by Queen Isabella to the governor of the first Spanish colony in the Americas, Santo Domingo, that no Jews, no Moors, no heretics be admitted. And then 7 years after this ruling by Queen Isabella, this ban not only encompassed Jews, but also their descendants. But the bureaucracy of the Spanish colonies was too thinly spread, and the distances were too enormous for such measures to be effective. New Christians leaving Spain from Seville sometimes disguised themselves as soldiers or priests, and these groups required no license to migrate, or they left by illegally acquiring licenses for shipment to the American colonies. Despite the obvious dangers, some of them tried to keep professing their former religion in the colonies, which led King Philip II in 1569 to issue a decree that established seats of the Inquisition in Spanish America, which happened in the next few years in both Mexico and Peru. The Inquisition, or the inquisitors, I have to say, were to be appointed by and responsible to the king. The task was to find out whether colonial people had in their midst those who had strayed from Catholic orthodoxy. So-called Judaizers could be punished if they were to invoke or consult devils, if they were to say that Jesus Christ was a mere man and that his mother was not a virgin, and if they were to possess the Talmud or other prohibited Jewish books. Those who were found guilty of Judaizing were condemned in public spectacles, such as the one you have on the screen, which is one from Madrid in 1680. But there was also a famous one held in Mexico City in 1596, where 45 out of the 67 people that were punished were Judaizers. Sometimes, but not very often, they were burned at the stake. In Mexico, the climate was favorable for settlement of these secret Jews, or as they are sometimes referred to, crypto Jews, hidden Jews. The Mexican economy boomed, the mining sector was expanding, and agriculture and stock raising and textile production were keeping pace. So arriving crypto Jews were quickly absorbed into mainstream economic and social life. In the capital city, the leader of a clan directed commercial affairs of his family and supervised housing, marriage, burial, and religious ceremonies of these arriving people of Jewish descent. Often, the passage of a nephew or a cousin from Spain or Portugal was financed by such a leader, arranged through contacts with a relative in Seville or Lisbon. Once settled in Mexico, the Judaizers did not live in particular quarters, but they did move around and lived in several towns, both in urban centers and in villages. They worked in many different professions, in medicine, law, cobbling, winemaking. Some of them were small merchants, some were shopkeepers, some were itinerant peddlers. It's hard to distinguish between the descendants of Jews who hid their Judaism and those who were actually genuine Christians. Both groups were known as New Christians, even many generations after their conversion to Christianity. These New Christians were not just important in Mexico, but even more so in South America, where they came to control a good part of the commodity flow between Brazil and Europe. At the same time, they also became heavily involved in the slave trade, controlled at this point by Portugal. In Europe, the new Christian presence was particularly important in the port of Antwerp, in what today is Belgium, a port that was briefly Europe's main commercial center. New Christian merchants who settled in Antwerp enjoyed a special asset, which was their excellent relations with the Portuguese crown that practically monopolized the spice trade. And as a consequence, almost the whole distribution of Portuguese East Indian spices and Brazilian sugar to Northern Europe was handled by the Portuguese New Christians residing in Antwerp. In the year 1580, Spain annexed its Portuguese neighbor, which gave rise to the so-called Crown Union between the two countries that would last for 60 years. And this Crown Union enabled Portuguese New Christian merchants to cross the Spanish border and infiltrate the Spanish trade with the Americas. Portuguese merchants, or their agents, settled in key parts of Spanish America, like Panama and Lima, Buenos Aires, Cartagena de Indias. And it is, of course, by no means true that these men were all Judaizers, nor did they work within entirely new Christian networks. But still, the growing presence of new Christians brought the Spanish Inquisition into play, most famously in Lima, where an alleged conspiracy in 1639 resulted in an auto da fe. And the auto da fe is the moment of punishment, which you see on the screen. The mid-17th century was a traumatic period for American New Christians, many of whom were persecuted for Judaizing, which was often a pretext used by the Inquisition for going after the fortunes of wealthy men, since the Spanish Inquisition, which was notoriously cash-strapped, would keep the goods confiscated from convicted prisoners. Judicial persecution of many New Christians inevitably led to a significant reduction in Judaizing tendencies and to assimilation of the descendants of Jews into old Christian society, especially in Peru and later in Mexico too. Portugal had its own Inquisition, which was also prosecuting New Christians suspected of Judaizing, scores of whom left their native soil in large numbers and moved to Northern Europe. The migrants' destination after the mid-16th century, and especially by the late 16th century, was no longer primarily Antwerp, which was losing its significance as an international trading hub, but now to ports such as Amsterdam and Hamburg. And once they had arrived there, they often reverted to their ancestral religion, now professing Judaism freely. In the Spanish Empire, crypto-Judaism declined, but it didn't disappear. Against all odds, some men and women of Jewish descent kept trying to observe the religious injunctions of their ancestral faith. Fasting in Jewish culture, which could express repentance, reflection, but also accompanied the remembrance of important events in Jewish history, was at times hard to cover up. Among the subterfuges that crypto-Jews used to conceal fasting was to send their servants on lengthy errands at dinner time. And perhaps the clearest marker of the Jewish faith of the New Christians was a celebration of the Sabbath. Because Jewish books virtually disappeared after 1492, these crypto-Jews celebrated without reading the Torah or reciting lengthy prayers. Among most groups of crypto-Jews, Sabbath observance seems to have taken place largely on Friday evening. And we may wonder where they met for their services. What was sometimes referred to as a synagogue was usually just a room in a private house or a space that was set aside in a store or a warehouse. How many synagogues of this type there were in the crypto-Jewish world is hard to say, but In Brazil, there were at least 6 in the 1590s, while in Mexico, 15 have been identified in the capital city alone, with perhaps 9 elsewhere in the colony. Wealthy crypto-Jews also enlisted the help of their servants or slaves in preparing for the Sabbath. In Brazil, in 1595, Branca Dias was accused of having these servants wash the floor of her house in preparation for the Sabbath. This was always dangerous because servants, who were usually not Jewish, could betray their masters to the Inquisition. On the Sabbath, Judaizers also tried to observe the requirement not to work, the fourth commandment. In Brazil, for instance, a school teacher was denounced because, quote, on Saturdays he did not hold class and he ordered his students not to come to class, end of quote. More often, probably, Judaizers could not afford to abstain from work out of fear of being discovered or because they needed the money. At times, they compromised by working intermittently. All of these glimpses of Judaizing new Christians we obtain from the files of the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisitions, which are rich, but they're also problematic because it is by no means clear that the confessions of Judaizers or accusations made against them were true. It could be argued that they were, as one historian has written, the byproduct of inquisitorial procedure or generalized anti-Jewish prejudice. The practices to which I have referred were included in a whole range of rites and observances that were considered to be Judaic by both Inquisitions, and that these so-called stereotypical attributes were confirmed by the accused in their confessions does not necessarily mean that they were true, and not only because some statements were obtained by torture. The accused would pay a heavy price for denying the charges against them, if the Inquisition considered them to be proven. In that case, refusing to make a confession would prevent the alleged Judaizer from being reconciled with the church and readmitted into the Christian community. Those found guilty, who did not make a complete confession, faced the same consequences. They were therefore often eager to denounce the people whom the inquisitors considered their accomplices. It's therefore wrong to infer from the many confessions obtained by the Inquisition that crypto-Judaism was a widespread phenomenon, just as it is incorrect to take the thousands of confessions made by imputed witches in early modern Europe at face value. According to some historians, the unintended consequence of this targeting by the Inquisition of people with only a tenuous connection with their Jewish past was that they had to rely more on the new Christian community than before, which made it more likely for them to reconnect with their Judaic culture, all the more because they were alienated from the Catholicism that they had professed. In this way, persecution by the Inquisition reactivated old traditions. At least, that is what happened in some cases. Generally, however, these victims of the Inquisition had no experience of Jewish life at all, and to think that after their distressing encounter with the Inquisition, they would become part of a new Christian community where Judaizing was the norm would also be a mistake. Those communities were largely imagined, not by Jews or new Christians, but by the Inquisitions. The assumption of scholars who believe in the existence of those communities is that individuals derive their identity from belonging to that community, which nurtured the Judaizing tendencies. Now, for those new Christians looking for an authentically Jewish community, let me move to the next slide. For those new Christians who were looking for an authentically Jewish community, possibilities opened up in Northern Europe and across the ocean, starting in the 1590s, when Amsterdam became a destination for a growing number of Portuguese merchants and their families. And what you have here on the screen is the big synagogue opened in Amsterdam in the 17th century, which, when it opened, was actually the largest synagogue in the world. And here is an idea of the Jewish neighborhood in Amsterdam, Vlooienburg, which doesn't exist anymore, not since the early 20th century. But this is where the Sephardi Jews moved when they started arriving in the 1590s, and this is where the vast majority of them lived in the 17th century. After a slow beginning, this avenue, this new abode, was used with increasing frequency. For Judaizers, one attractive feature of this Dutch port was the toleration that they enjoyed, as well as the right to establish synagogues and Jewish schools, and to bury their dead in a Jewish cemetery. Of course, not all of the Portuguese immigrants to Amsterdam were or became Jewish. Some were old Christians who had no demonstrable Jewish ancestors. Others were new Christians, but opted not to convert to Judaism. Wary of both the Inquisition, but likewise of the strict leadership of the local Jewish community, these people preferred to be left alone. What they all had in common is that they belonged to the so-called Portuguese nation, which had its own customs and interests. And one conspicuous feature of the men of the Portuguese nation was their mobility. They moved around in Europe and frequently sailed across the Atlantic in an age when seaborne voyages were notoriously hazardous. From this new abode of Amsterdam, the Portuguese New Christians, many of whom converted to Judaism, contributed in a significant manner to the Dutch Golden Age. Their niche was the trade with Portugal and its colonial empire, from where they received a wide array of luxury products, including Indian diamonds and Brazilian sugar, in exchange for wheat, grain, and other goods from Northern Europe. Amsterdam came to be connected in the early years of the 17th century to Brazil, when both planters and merchants settled in the Dutch port and converted to Judaism. They'd often been involved in exporting Brazilian sugar to Amsterdam, and now these commercial ties facilitated a return to Judaism. But most of the so-called new Jews that settled in Amsterdam arrived not from Brazil, but from Portugal. A sizable number of them openly lobbied for the conquest by the Dutch West India Company of Brazil. And here you have the old headquarters of the West India Company in Amsterdam. Many of them moved to Dutch Brazil in 1630 when the conquest of Brazil began. Even among the soldiers that were on board that first fleet that was destined to conquer the colony, we find at least 40 Iberian Jews and 20 German Jews. And it was in Dutch Brazil where the first Jewish congregations of the Americas would be established in the years ahead. Jewish Brazil resembled Jewish Amsterdam in the sense that the Judaizers returned to a full religious and cultural Jewish life by copying institutions that had recently been established in the Dutch port. Here is an idea of Dutch Brazil at its height. It included about half of Brazil as it existed back then. Here we have the twin cities, Recife and Mauritsstad to its north. This is where the first synagogues in the Americas were established in the 1630s. And the man who was the first rabbi in the community of Recife was Isaac Aboab, who therefore can count as the very first actual American rabbi. After 1630, Portuguese men already residing in Brazil could also convert to Judaism, but the conditions also allowed a movement in the opposite direction by enabling the new Jews, those who arrived from Amsterdam, to return to Catholicism. Several cases are known of new Christians resident in Brazil who became Jews after 1630, only to return to Catholicism at a later date. One example is the Portuguese-born Pedro de Almeida, three of whose four grandparents had been new Christians. He lived as a teenager in Brazil and tried to return to Portugal at the age of 17 when his ship was captured by the Dutch. He was then brought to the port of Recife, where he disembarked, and he was persuaded there by the cousin of his mother to adopt Judaism and to learn the prayers and rituals of a pious Jew. He hesitated, however, and when he was about to leave for the Dutch Republic to be circumcised, he expressed a desire to go back to Catholicism. His relatives convinced him to refrain from making that move, and he was then circumcised locally by the brother of the cousin. 3 years later, however, he did abandon Judaism altogether. Other new Christians flirted, so to speak, with Judaism. A group of women in Dutch Brazil, all Portuguese, availed themselves of Dutch tolerance by celebrating the Sabbath and taking their cues from nearby Jews, but they never converted to Judaism out of fear of a Dutch defeat. But well into the 18th century, women from this family would be subject to inquisitorial investigations. Among the settlers of Dutch Brazil was Aaron Serfati, who had been the first Portuguese Jew to be circumcised in Amsterdam in the year 1597. He was elected president of Recif's congregation. Another arrival was David Abravanel Dormido, a new Christian who'd been a treasurer for the Spanish king Philip IV, but who was convicted for Judaizing. With his wife and daughter, he spent 5 years in an Inquisition prison before his release in 1632. Via France, he made his way to Amsterdam, where he settled in 1640 before moving on to Brazil. While these are success stories, there are also numerous poor men and women that we can find among the Jewish settlers arriving in Brazil from Amsterdam. One such group, who planned to settle in as yet uncolonized areas of Brazil, we know about from the archives. By 1645, one community leader in Brazil complained about these people and the extreme poverty of the Jewish nation. Even respectable persons, he argued, had resigned themselves to live on charity. Economic opportunities had attracted these ocean-crossing Jews, but equally important were the privileges that they looked forward to enjoying on the far side of the Atlantic. The Dutch government in Brazil guaranteed freedom of conscience for the Jews and allowed them, as I mentioned, to open the first synagogue in the history of the New World. It will be actually next month when I'll speak more about these privileges. The decade of the 1640s was a tumultuous one on either side of the Atlantic. Portugal declared its independence from Spain, starting a long war that was eventually crowned with success. And in Brazil, Portuguese settlers rebelled against Dutch rule, reducing the area under Dutch control and enabling ultimately in 1654 a Portuguese fleet to defeat the Dutch. This rebellion of the Portuguese planters in 1645 rocked the foundations of the world of Dutch Jewry. Economically and emotionally, the events were such a shock that it would take them many years to recover. The news of the rebellion led Brazil's Jews to collect an impressive sum of money to be distributed to the Dutch soldiers. So this is in the 9 years between the start of the revolt and the eventual defeat in 1654. Such generosity did not prevent the sad fate that awaited several Jews at the hands of the Portuguese. Immediately after the start of the revolt, local Portuguese residents killed 3 Jews, while 2 others were caught and hanged on the same day that 2 more Jews were captured elsewhere, baptized, and killed. Several others were sent to Lisbon, where the Inquisition tried them. One of these was condemned to die, but those who could prove that they were born Jews were eventually released. As the persecution grew, the Dutch government ordered in an unambiguous statement that went far beyond the guarantee of tolerance that the Jews who remained in Dutch Brazil were to receive protection from any damage to person or property. Although that rebellion against Dutch rule was a big blow to the Jewish inhabitants, numerous Jews in Amsterdam continued to associate the New World with hope. Among religious Jews, the hope for redemption and the prayer for the coming of the Messiah was almost a daily ritual. Without their belief in the imminence of the Messiah, they would have abandoned Judaism. Messianism was given an important new impulse by a one-time resident of Dutch Brazil, Antonio de Montesinos, and I'll also come back to this in a future lecture in this 4-part series. Montesinos arrived in Amsterdam in 1644 to tell the rabbi, Manasseh ben Israel, the story of his meeting with South American Indians, whom he took for Hebrew-speaking Jews and members of the 10 lost tribes. The rabbi believed that this was the sign that the coming of the Messiah was near. In planning new settlements in both England and in the Americas, especially for the persecuted Jews from Iberia and Poland, the Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel revealed his practical and his messianic side. Such migration, he hoped, would accelerate the dispersal of the Jews all over the globe, which was a precondition of the coming of the Messiah. What helped these ideas of Manasseh ben Israel gain currency was that he resided in Amsterdam, which was sometimes called the Jerusalem of the West, whose Jewish congregation developed into the mother community of most Jewish settlements that sprang up in the Americas. The Jews in Brazil, Guyana, the Caribbean, and North America now began to return to full religious and cultural life, Jewish life. The Askamot, the bylaws of the Amsterdam congregation, were the archetype for all 17th century congregations in the Americas. In Barbados and in Curacao, even the number of articles, 42, followed the Dutch original. The Amsterdam communal leaders spent thousands of guilders to sponsor Jewish migration to new colonies and donated Torah scrolls, I believe I have, yes, Torah scrolls to these various new colonies, New Amsterdam, Barbados, Cayenne, Curacao, and Martinique. I could talk about every single one of these colonies where the Jews settled, but let me briefly mention one that I've studied in depth and that's rarely mentioned, which is Cayenne, which is today's French Guyana. Cayenne was located on what the Dutch in the 17th century called the Wild Coast, which was the area between the Orinoco Delta in the east of Venezuela and Brazil. It's in this particular area, this tropical area, where the northern Europeans established many short-lived colonies, but some of them were to last. In Cayenne, it was actually a Christian merchant in Amsterdam who took the initiative. He knew that the French had left Cayenne behind and that there were many so-called unoccupied lands. So he approached the States General, the Dutch government, in 1655 with a request to establish a Dutch colony in Cayenne in an area that he said was suitable for growing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other crops. A few years after Christian settlers had pioneered this Dutch colony, a group of Jewish migrants, and they were probably all Sephardim, led by their patroon, David Nassi, who had traveled initially on the same ship as the Christians, began arriving as well. These Jewish passengers wanted to settle, as had been promised to them, on a peninsula where they knew there was fertile ground, but upon their arrival, the Dutch Christian commander of the colony denied them that right. After complaints from the Jewish settlers, eventually reached the West India Company headquarters in Amsterdam, the commander was ordered to allocate the Jews their promised lands, which he finally did. David Nassi, the Jewish leader, born in 1612 in Portugal, he would die in Amsterdam in 1685. He had moved as a young adult from Portugal to Amsterdam. He then left for Dutch Brazil when he was in his early 20s, where he worked as a merchant and he bought a sugar mill, a sugar plantation, which he lost when the Dutch had to surrender in 1654. He then went back to Amsterdam, where there was actually in 1654 not enough room for all those returning Jewish immigrants, and when many of them were bound to live in dire poverty. So Nassi therefore took it upon himself to find a new home on the other side of the ocean. He was not a wealthy man. In fact, he was an average taxpayer within Amsterdam's Jewish community. Most of the other Amsterdam Jews who served as financial backers of the colony in Cayenne were also on the poor side. But there was one exception, and that was Abraham Cohen, born around 1613, and he would die in 1671. He was also an underwriter of this colony. He had lived in Dutch Brazil, hence his nickname do Brasil. He had lived there for 20 years. And all indications are that he was the West India Company's leading bondholder, not leading Jewish bondholder, but of all the bondholders, he was the number one. And along with the other underwriters of Cayenne, Cohen may have been motivated in part by the belief that the coming of the Jewish Messiah was near, which would entail the restoration of the sovereignty of the Jewish people. Establishing colonies, just like in Manasseh's idea, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel's idea, would speed up the global dispersal of Jews. The ship that carried the first Jews to Cayenne bore the name the Promised Land, which probably is significant here. Unlike Cohen, underwriter Abraham Drago had few assets, and yet he was deeply involved in the planning of Jewish colonies. He was also born in Portugal. He migrated to Dutch Brazil in 1648, went back to Amsterdam, and now first championed the new Jewish settlement in Curaçao. In fact, he himself was one of the very first Jewish settlers of the island, arriving there with 3 non-Jewish men who would work for him. In 1660, Drago did something similar for Cayenne, although he never himself settled in that colony. After the French conquest of Cayenne in 1664, most of the Jews took advantage of the offer of the conquerors to submit to French rule while maintaining their privileges. Other Jews moved back to the Dutch Republic, while some settled in Barbados and Jamaica. The Jews who remained in Cayenne witnessed another conquest just 2 years later, this time by an English force, which took the Jews to Suriname, a colony back then still under English rule. And then, yet another year later, this same group experienced yet another changing of the guard when the Dutch squadron captured Suriname. In Suriname, the Jews continued the tropical agriculture that they had begun in Cayenne. David Nassi and his son Samuel Nassi became the leaders of the local Jewish community, while in Amsterdam, Abraham Drago continued where he had left off with Cayenne, supporting the new colony in all possible ways. Jews also began to move to the English islands in the Caribbean, and did so around the same time that they were welcome again in England. England, which had expelled its Jews in the year 1290. Even though some Judaizers are known to have lived in England in the subsequent centuries, there was still no legal basis for their presence in the mid-17th century. Manasseh ben Israel, the same rabbi I just mentioned, actually played a role in encouraging the English leader, Oliver Cromwell, to readmit Jews. In the face of opposition from both merchants who feared Jewish competition and some clergymen who expected blasphemy from Jewish immigrants, Cromwell took no formal action, but resident Jews, who all hailed from the Iberian Peninsula, went ahead and started organizing their community by renting a room that would be used as a synagogue and buying a plot of land for use as a cemetery. That was the start of a new chapter of Jewish life in England. So the readmission of Jews to England would, in due course, enable London to become the second mother community for Atlantic Jews after Amsterdam. And that was in part a consequence of the migration of large numbers of Jews from Amsterdam to England, which happened for 2 reasons. England was now becoming the main trading partner of Portugal, where many Amsterdam Jews obviously had good contacts, and the second reason, residing in England gave these Amsterdam Jews access to English islands in the Caribbean, once again, in particular Barbados and Jamaica, colonies that offered prospective European immigrants a tempting perspective. The exodus from Dutch Brazil also led to the French islands in the Caribbean of Martinique and Guadeloupe. A large contingent of Jews and Dutch Christians made their way to Martinique, where the Jesuit priests convinced the owner of the island to bar these foreigners who would only introduce heresy and Judaism in the colony, he said. So refused entrance, the refugees then continued their travels and landed at Guadeloupe, where the proprietor was less scrupulous. More than 900 persons, including 500 slaves, disembarked. Jews were later allowed to settle in Martinique, but by the order of King Louis XIV, they were all expelled from the islands in 1685. But in the meantime, there was a vibrant Jewish life in Martinique. And one example of the connection that was now forged between Martinique and Amsterdam is provided by a man named Moses da Silva, who I've been researching recently in the Amsterdam archives. So, born in France, in Bayonne, he undertook many initiatives to trade with Martinique. He owned a ship called the Prophet Samuel, which sailed back and forth between Amsterdam and the French island. In order to maintain these contacts with Martinique, he sailed more than once himself on one of the ships that sailed there. And apart from the Prophet Samuel, these ships included one with the name the 12 Tribes of Israel. The shippers of these ships were mainly and sometimes even exclusively Sephardi Jews, as can be seen from this cargo list. So these are the people who loaded the ships with cargo. This is a ship that, as it says here, goes to Martinique on top in the year 1659. And here on the bottom, we can see the names of the people who provided the cargo. He is a man named Abraham da Gama, underneath Samuel Barcilai, Sebastian Coutinho, Francisco da Costa, Abraham del Soto. It seems that every single person loading this ship was a Sephardi Jew. In these American colonies where Jews settled, they would dedicate themselves to trade, but also to tropical agriculture wherever possible. Although anti-Semitism never disappeared, Jewish life in slave societies was relatively untroubled because the rule by a European minority over an enslaved black majority led to a pragmatic solidarity among the Europeans that allowed Jews, you might say, to become white. So this first stage, you might say, of the Americanization of Jewry was all about Jews who hailed from the Iberian Peninsula, either directly or through their ancestors. Ashkenazi Jews could be found in some of the English and Dutch colonies in the later 17th century, but by then they were still few and far between. Initially, Iberian Jews dominated. As a transition took place from new Christians to new Jews, which is a term that's been used by historians in historiographical literature, these people who rediscovered Judaism. These new Jews were not set apart from the rest of society. On the one hand, they were, of course, religiously different, and the first generation hardly spoke the local tongue, whether it was Dutch or English, which was especially true for the lower classes, and that did make them different, at least initially. Only the members of the commercial elites were able to speak in Dutch or English. On the other hand, they often teamed up with Christians in their economic endeavors, and as more Jews were born in the adopted fatherlands of their parents, their ability to communicate in the local vernaculars increased. Few of these new Jews had any knowledge of Hebrew, which was reserved for prayer and Torah study by the rabbinic elites. We know less of the colonial communities that emerged in the 17th century than we know about Europe, especially regarding lower class Jews, but the situation there was probably similar. One difference between most Atlantic Jewish communities was that in most there was quite a return migration to Europe, but there was not in the colony of Suriname. Suriname, the colony that would have the largest Jewish population anywhere in the Americas in the 18th century. So different from their Christian neighbors in Curacao, Jews tended to remain in the colony. Return migration to the Dutch Republic was conspicuously small, and this unusual stability, the unusual stability of the colonial community of Jews in Suriname derived from this lack of return migration. Elsewhere, return migration did take place. I have one example on the screen now. When you look at the third line, you can see Rachel Machora. This is spelled in the phonetic Dutch way. The year, as you can see on top, is 1690. This woman, Rachel Machora, was born in Barbados, and she gets married in the year 1690 with a man from Amsterdam, born in Amsterdam, named Shabbatai Cohen. So there is an increasing number of Jews born in the Americas that now also can be found in European port cities. She is just one of them. Let me turn to the colony of Curacao. Here first we have an image of Suriname, and I'll deal with that in later lectures more extensively, because here we have Joden savanne, which was an agricultural a Jewish community, and perhaps the largest agricultural Jewish community anywhere in the world. But let me now turn to the other large Jewish community in the Americas in the 18th century, that of Curacao, as you can see, just off the coast of Venezuela, with its beautiful synagogue, the longest continuously functioning synagogue anywhere in the Americas. And this is the synagogue from the interior. The very first settler, Jewish settler of Curacao, was a native, once again, of Portugal, who had moved to Amsterdam and then lived in Dutch Brazil. This man, João de Jan, was initially only allowed by the West India Company to cultivate fruit and other produce, which severely limited his options. But it may have been very hard for him to live up to the agreement that he made, because the soil of the island was and is very arid. Entire years would pass by without a single drop of rain. Nor did João de Jan have any experience as a planter. Instead, he had always been a merchant, with contacts extending to Portugal, Brazil, and Angola. And now, on Curacao, he started doing what he was not allowed to do, importing horses and supplying flour and clothing to the soldiers and the officials of the Dutch West India Company. And that trend, the trend that he started, was then continued by other Jews arriving from Amsterdam. In due course, commercial ties were forged with the Spanish colonies in the area. But initially, Curaçao's Jews had no choice but to sell goods to the Dutch West India Company. The ever-growing Jewish population played a key role in transforming this island from a sleepy backwater into one of the leading ports in the Americas by the year 1700. Before too long, many and perhaps even most merchants and ship owners were Jews who made full use of their particular advantages, which included their mastery of the Spanish language, but also their family networks across the Atlantic, with various relatives acting as business associates. The vast majority of the cocoa, tobacco, hides, and other shipments sent by Curaçaoan Jews to Amsterdam were consigned to other Jews, quite often members of the same family. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Europe, Jews benefited from the activities of their American co-religionists by setting up sugar refineries and tobacco workshops. Some merchants themselves became involved in these industries and had an obvious advantage over competitors who bought their materials wholesale. Sugar refining appeared on the Portuguese Jewish scene in Amsterdam suddenly in the mid-1650s, many years after these refineries had become quite commonplace in Amsterdam. The first Portuguese Jewish refinery was established in 1655 by Abraham and Isaac Pereira. In that year, the city fathers overruled the protest of Dutch Christian sugar refiners and declared sugar refining open to Jewish entrepreneurs. Most of these refineries would remain in Portuguese Jewish hands for only a relatively short amount of time. If, for Jews in the Americas, at the same time, European markets were essential to their livelihoods, Europe was also important for the establishment and the maintenance of Jewish religious communities in the Americas, whether it was through the shipment of Torah scrolls or engraved gravestones or the selection of rabbis and chazans. Amsterdam and London functioned as mother communities, as I mentioned before, of these Jewish congregations in the Caribbean and North America. And to give you one example, in 1757, the congregation Shevet Israel of New York wrote a letter to the Mahamat, the Council of Communal Elders of London, asking for a chazan who should be, quote, a young man of morals and strictly religious, with the advantage of an agreeable voice and the capacity for the teaching of Hebrew and translating it into English as well as Spanish. The man also had to read prayers and to teach poor boys for a salary of £50. The Mahamat agreed to look for a candidate, but they asked whether the £50 included extras, without which the post would be somewhat unattractive. They also insisted that the chazan's passage and expenses be paid and the agreement be made for a specific number of years. Furthermore, since it was late in the season, they let the New Yorkers know nobody could go out before the spring. The answer from New York was, we have no objection, to a married man, but would choose one rather if with a small family and not attended with much charge, as our congregation is small and few that are able to contribute to the support thereof. So this is a reference to the poverty that I mentioned before that we can still see in many of these Jewish communities for a long time. Apart from Amsterdam and London, other European ports also developed close ties directly and indirectly to Jewish America. Take, for example, the southern French port of Bayonne, a place that may not even ring a bell to many of you. So let me show you a table that I just constructed from, researching the Dutch archives in Amsterdam. Starting in the middle of the 16th century, new Christians had settled just on the other side of the border with France. Jews coming from Spain and Portugal who would only finally receive privileges as Jews by the year 1723. But before that, many Christians, new Christians who embraced Judaism, arrived there and tried to live a Jewish life. Eventually, through their cocoa imports from the Americas, they helped the quickly growing chocolate industry of Bayonne. And Bayonne to this day is known as the chocolate capital almost of France. So on this table, you can see the engagements of Bayonne Jews who first moved to Amsterdam and also from some nearby towns in southwestern France who got engaged in Amsterdam. And you can see the number spiking in the 1680s and the 1690s, which had to do with the fact that about 93 families, I believe, were expelled by the French king in the year 1684 for poverty. So where could they go? They ended up in Amsterdam, and then in subsequent years, we see many of these Bayonne Jews, having lived in Amsterdam, moving to the Americas. Quite a number are sent to Jamaica, and I found a few in Curacao as well. So Bayonne is an interesting place. And it's right here, as you can see, the red place in southwestern France. It's located between the Iberian Peninsula and Jewish centers such as Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg. So in a way, Bayonne was a midway point commercially, but it was also a midway point from a religious point of view, because it developed into a site where new Christians became Jews before moving on to places where they could entirely freely profess their religion, not just in Europe, but all over the Americas. As you can see on the left, we find all the communities where the Jews born in Bayonne as Catholics would finally live as Jews in Barbados, Jamaica, Curacao, Louisiana, Martinique, Nova Scotia, Saint-Domingue, St. Eustatius, and St. Thomas, in English, Dutch, French, and Danish America. Jews from Bayonne were especially active in the importation of cod from Newfoundland, and their Jewishness was sometimes underlined by the names, once again, of the ships that they chartered, such as the King David. In the 17th century, a number of Jews from Bayonne settled in Martinique, where they bought land and slaves and planted crops such as cocoa. In the 18th century, Jews from Bayonne lived in Jamaica, Suriname, and Curacao. In those places, people from Bayonne often married each other and cherished the memory of Bayonne. In fact, in their wills, they often bequeathed money to relatives that still lived in Bayonne or to the poor there. That overseas Jews did not forget the native ground of Bayonne is shown in the case of one Jamaican Jew, Abraham Pereira Mesquita, who instructed his father, who lived in Bayonne, to buy for him a country property, quote, in the land where he wished to return to make his home, end of quote. Unfortunately for him, he died before he could enjoy his retirement. Abraham Pereira Mesquita was one of many Jews who found a new abode in the Americas, where Jewish males were active in the pursuits in which they had been generally tolerated for centuries, especially trade and brokerage. Different from many parts of Europe, Jews were allowed to own land in the Dutch and English colonies, where the more prosperous among them became planters. In both capacities, as merchants and planters, They did not completely leave Europe behind. As in the case of Bayonne, their wills reveal lasting bonds tying them together with fellow Jews an ocean away. That is the end of today's lecture. I'm giving back now the floor to Michael Steinberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kluster. Thank you for the presentation. I certainly consider this an important eye-opening discussion, and we look forward to part two, which will take place Sunday, April 19th. Ladies and gentlemen, friends of Jewish Heritage Alliance, you have just witnessed the level of educational programming we deliver year-round, programs we've been offering for nearly 6 years now at no cost. If you value our work, please consider supporting us with a donation using the link in the chat or the QR code on your screen. Your support helps us to continue these programs and many other initiatives that help bring the history and the legacy of the Jews of the Peninsula, of the Iberian Peninsula, to life. Our work, by the way, does not stop at the gates of history. We also produce forward-thinking programs, including our planned Converso online community initiative, a platform designed to help millions of descendants of conversos, Jews that were forcibly converted during medieval times and lost connection to their heritage. This project is designed to help reconnect them with their Jewish roots. This initiative aims to build a community of millions strong, and thereby creating a powerful platform that will help to combat today's tsunami of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel propaganda and misinformation. So here's your chance to get involved and support our work. You can help through either a tax-deductible donation or by sponsoring programs or initiatives that advance our important mission, preserving history, educating today's audience, and helping shape a better tomorrow. Feel free to contact me for more information. One final note before we leave, I would like to mention our educational tour series. These are unique, specially designed tour programs intended to bring the story of Sfarad to life. In honor of today's program and all the new participants, we are offering a special $500 gift or discount, whichever you want to call it, for our May 5th Portugal departure. Please contact us if you would like more details. In closing, once again, I would like to thank our presenter, Professor Kluster, for a captivating presentation. And thank you all to our audience for your continued interest in the saga of Sfarad. Later today, I will be sending you information for part 2 of the series, Jewish Privileges on the Atlantic World. Hope to see you April 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you and goodbye for now.